Today I'm working in my Strathmore visual journal, and to begin with I'm going to use gesso on my page. This is the Prima heavy gesso, and then I'm going to add some fresco finish paint by Paper Artsy. So I have Irish Moss, Nougat are the first two colours that I use on the page, and these are quite light pastel colours. And then I'm going to also add some quinacridone Nicolazo Gold, which is a golden fluid acrylic. Next I'm going to stamp on the background, so I'm using a Stampin' Up! Crackle background stamp, and I'm using a pearlescent ink by Brilliance. This is the pearlescent beige, so it's going to add a little bit of shimmer to the background. Next, I'm using some hexagon dies. This is the Straight Hexagon by Nellie Snellen, and I've cut some of the hexagon shapes onto 160 GSM paper. I do tend to use a lightweight paper in my journal so it doesn't get too bulky. And now I'm painting them with some fresco finish paint. This is the Mermaid. And I give it one coat of this, and then I decide that when it dries a little bit darker than what I wanted. So off camera I mix some of the Mermaid paint with a little bit of titanium white, and then I achieve the colour that I was after. Now I'm going to stamp the pieces using an archival ink. This is Aquamarine, and the text stamp that I'm using is by Impression Obsession, and it's called Beauty Text. And I'm not stamping it perfectly, I'm making sure that I have a distressed appearance and that the ink also is not too dark on the images. Where it has become a little bit dark in places, I'm adding a little bit of titanium white over the top just to send it more into the background. Once the pieces have dried, I arrange them on the page where I want them, and I adhere them down using Golden's Soft Gel Medium. Now I want to add some text to my page. This is a font set that I bought from Etsy, and the font is called Blind Melon. I'm using archival ink because it's permanent, and I'm stamping straight onto my page. Now I'm using a second alphabet set. This is a PSX peg set called Celtic alphabet. Unfortunately, PSX are now out of business, but there are lots of different peg type alphabet sets that you can get. Studio G do quite a lot of different fonts as an alternative to this. And now to finish my text, I'm going back to the first alphabet set, which was the Blind Melon font. Now I want to add some collage images to my page. This is a sheet of seashells by Graphic Stock, and I will leave the link to that website in the video description. And I'm just cutting out the ones that I want, and I'm going to place these on the hexagon die cuts that I prepared earlier. I'm using matte medium to adhere these down. I've switched from the soft gel medium because matte medium is more fluid and it is easier to work with, although the soft gel medium is a little bit stronger, so I needed that for the cardstock that the hexagons were made of. Now I'm using a pan pastel. This is the turquoise tint, and I'm using this just to lighten around the edges of the hexagon shapes and create a sort of misty haze. Now I'm going to use some Lemire paint. This is the Pearl Turquoise, and I'm going to use this to go around the hexagon shapes. I'm painting it onto the edge of the shape and also a little bit onto the page, and this will help to integrate those shapes into the page so they look a little bit more cohesive. Now I want to add some texture to my background, so for this I've chosen a Crafter's Workshop stencil. This is the mini chicken wire reversed, and I'm using this along with a palette knife and Liquitex light moulding paste. And I'm making sure that when I stencil through, I'm doing this quite randomly, not all over the page, but I am making sure that the paste goes onto the hexagons as well as onto the background page, and this is just another method to make everything look more cohesive and integrated. Once the texture paste has dried, I'm painting it with a Stuart Gill paint. This is from their Meta Mica range, and the colour is Chestnut. The Meta Mica range of paints from Stuart Gill are very similar to the Lemire's in that they have a shimmer finish. In this case it tends to be quite a silvery shimmer to them, and this colour was selected because it is very similar to one of the colours that is dominant in most of the shells, so a darkish brown colour. It actually looked a lot like molten metal when it was being applied to the page, but it did dry slightly lighter. Now I'm using another Crafters Workshop stencil. This is the Mini Punchinella, and I'm going back to the Lumiere paint in the Pearl Turquoise, and I'm going to apply this using a piece of Ranger cut and dry foam. And I do find this is the easiest way to apply paint. If you use a piece of the cut and dry foam that's very lightly loaded, then you're less likely to get the paint seeping out from under the stencil and distorting your design. The next thing I'm going to do on the page is add some shadowing detail to the shells. So for this I've chosen another Paper Artsy colour. This is Bora Bora, which is slightly darker than the Mermaid colour, which was actually mixed with some white at the beginning. So this is going to provide some contrast and the shadowing colour to begin with, and then later I'm going to add something a little bit darker as well. Next, I'm going to add some additional texture to the background, and for this I'm going to use some glass bead gel by Golden, and I'm going to mix this with some gold accent beads as well as some Lumiere paint. Now when you mix paint with the glass bead gel, if it has a shimmer or iridescence like the Lumiere paint or the Stuart Gill, you do lose that shimmer unfortunately, but in this case it was really just the colour that I was after. The glass bead gel will dry to a transparent finish, but it will take on the colour of paints. They do tend to be a little bit lighter than if they were used directly from the jar, however. The idea of using the glass bead gel mixed with the Lumiere paint was to make it look almost like a sea foam, and I added the accent beads because I thought that they might look like sand, which would obviously go with the theme of the rest of the page. As I've already mentioned, the glass bead gel does dry to a transparent finish so that you can see the glass beads in there, and in this case the gold accent beads that I've added. But when you've mixed it with paint, it can be a little bit difficult to predict exactly how it will dry and what level of transparency you'll have. So if you are new to using this medium, you might want to test it out first on a scrap of paper and just leave it to dry, so you can see whether it's the finish that you're happy with or not. Now I'm going to add colour to the text, so I've gone back to the Stuart Gill paint in Chestnut, and I'm just going to apply that using a detail brush. And to add some final touches to the page, I'm using the Stuart Gill paint I've watered it down quite a lot, and I'm just using a wash of that paint to add a slightly darker border around the whole page. Now I'm using a card dipped in some of the Stuart Gill paint to highlight the smallest word on the page, because I felt like it needed to stand out a little bit more. And I'm also adding some more shadow to the shells, and I'm using the Lumiere paint for this. That was the last step of the page. I hope you enjoyed watching. As always, there is a link to the full product list in the video description, as well as all my social media links. And if you hang around, you'll see the close-ups of the finished page at the end of the video.